Good morning.
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 Thanks for being here. You're listening to Scriabin's Prometheus, or the Poem of Fire, which we're going to look at a little bit later in class today. So I'm looking forward to talking about Scriabin's music with all of you, with a particular emphasis on the Opus 51, number 2, the A minor prelude, which was part of your homework assignment for today. So you've already had a chance to listen to the piece, so we won't spend too much class time listening to the entire piece. We'll listen to excerpts. So what we're going to do today is try to situate this A minor prelude within Scriabin's output as a whole and see what kind of music he was writing before this and what kind of music he ended up writing after. First, a little bit of background about Scriabin. Pianists are more likely to have heard of him because he wrote a lot of piano music. But if you don't play piano, you might never have heard of him. So here's a little bit of information about him. So he studied piano and composition at the Moscow Conservatory with highest honors. By most estimations, he was a piano prodigy. He also was a student of Sergei Rachmaninoff. They were at the Moscow Conservatory at the same time. Scriabin was highly influenced by French Romantic music, especially Chopin. We'll talk about that in a little bit. He was interested in this belief called theosophy, and it's sort of a mystical, occult society that has lots of strange beliefs. So, for instance, Scriabin was part of a secret society, we believe, called the Sons of the Flame of Wisdom. Sons of the Flame of Wisdom. And that was called a Promethean cult. And we'll see how that ties into Prometheus, or the Poem of Fire, a little later. So Opus 51 dates from the year 1906. A lot happened in 1906 for Scriabin. And probably the most earth-shattering event was the death of his child, Rima. And he was overcome with guilt because of her death. He was also broke at this time, so he's depressed and penniless. He had split from his publisher, so he had no means to earn money, and this forced him to undergo an American tour as a piano soloist. So it was a very rough year for Scriabin in many ways. So Opus 51, there are 4 pieces in the set. We'll be looking at the second one, and this marks an important turning point in his style. Previous to Opus 51, cadences had more or less acted the way we would expect them to, traditional 5-to-1 dominant tonic motion. But after Opus 51, he starts to alter what he does at cadential moments. And that's we're going to trace what Scriabin does with cadences throughout his entire life. So I just want to talk about cadences for the purposes of this class as consisting of 2 different parts. In the first part, we could say there's more tension and then there's more release. We could also say that the first part is usually more dissonant and the second part is more consonant. The first part active and passive, and then we use these words dominant function and tonic function. And of course the traditional harmonies we would associate with part 1 and part 2 would be 5-7 and 1. So, a little outline of what we're going to do today. The outline for today's class mirrors Scriabin's output as a whole. Like many other composers, like Stravinsky or Beethoven, musicologists tend to divide Scriabin's output into 3 periods. In the first period, you can see a clear influence of French Romanticism, and especially Chopin. And cadences behave exactly the way we would expect them to. In the middle period, things start to change a little bit. Other dominant 7th structures start to substitute for the 5-7 chord at the cadence, but the cadence still requires a resolution to a tonic chord. And this all changes in the late period, where he starts to put even more dissonance on the first part of the cadence, and eventually he starts to even do away with the tonic chord completely. And we talked about this in previous classes, where sometimes composers would use 2 dominant chords, a tritone apart. Scriabin uses this idea in a lot of his later music, and eventually he throws his hands up and he gets away with tonic triads totally, and the pieces don't even end with a triad. So we begin by looking at this early piece, and this is from his 24 Preludes, a famous set of 24. Anyone else can you think of a pianist who composed a set of 24 Preludes?
Chopin.
Chopin, indeed. And Scriabin's set even has the same key relationships. It goes C major, A minor, G major, E minor, just like Chopin did. So here is a piece that if you didn't know, you might think it was written by Chopin. Excuse me, just for a moment, I'm going to turn down the contrast a little bit. So here is another piece from that same set, Opus 11. This is from number 4, and this comes from the end. This is the end of the piece. I'll just get us situated in E minor, and I'm just going to play the end of this piece for you. Harmonic analysis of this passage. What key is it in? I already said it. It's in E minor. I'll do the first harmony for you. As soon as we get to the G sharp in the bass, this would be a 7 diminished 7 of 4. Now I want you to think about what bar 16 would be, and I'll give you a clue. The soprano note is a suspension. We've got our 3 parts of a dissonant suspension, preparation, suspension, and resolution. And as you know, is the suspension part a chord tone or a non-chord tone? Would be a non-chord tone. So discount the D from your harmonic analysis. David, what harmony might you label this?
Flat 2/6.
Yeah, very good. Very good, with the suspension there. And what's another name for the major triad built on flat 2? Neapolitan. Very good. So Neapolitan. The next harmony, I put a question mark. We're going to come back to it because you haven't seen this yet in your harmonic vocabulary. And the last 2 bars as a whole, how about Katrina? What harmonic label might we put there?
Maybe a conventional 6/4.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent. Very good. 5/6/4. And for our purposes, we'll just say that the ending is all tonic. So let's investigate what's happening at the question mark. Here is a harmony that you have seen before. And Miles, what's the interval between the outer voices from C up to A sharp?
Augmented 6.
Excellent. And anyone, what kind of augmented 6th is this? Very good. Very good. You learned your augmented 6th well. But I want you to watch carefully. I'm going to switch the position of the outer voices. And you'll see that it's still the same chord. But if we take the soprano, put it in the bass, take the bass, put it in the soprano. Now, how about Ethan? What interval do we have between the outer voices?
Diminished 3rd.
Yeah, very good. Tricky interval. And as you might guess, we call this a German diminished 3rd chord. So, and you've learned how the tendency tones in a German augmented 6th chord work. They work exactly the same way in German diminished third chord. Scale degree 6 goes down to 5. We would often keep common tones in the middle voice, and scale degree sharp 4 would go up to 5. The rule of thumb for any tendency tones is always wherever there's a half step. Wherever there's a half step, that's going to be a tendency tone. So we see here that the German augmented sixth and the German diminished third are inversionally equal, and this would be the traditional resolution to a cadential 6/4. So we can go back to our opus 11, number 4, and Ben, would you say that he resolves all of his tendency tones in the traditional way?
It looks like he does.
He does, absolutely. Yeah. So this is really traditional use of the German diminished third chord. And I would just like to do a rhythmic reduction of what's going on here. And I stripped away all the rhythm, and I want to point out that there's this nice ascending bass line going up by half steps from sharp 3 to 4 to sharp 4 to 5. Eventually to 1. And I don't really have to change much to show you that this is actually harmonized in a very traditional keyboard style, like this. And so the fact that traditional voice leading procedures underlie this music is one of the reasons that we make students do part writing in the first place, because composers would take an underlying structure like this and embellish it in myriad different ways, but there's still a traditional voice leading structure underlying the whole thing.
That's what we part right.
That's exactly right. That's right, you've been wondering. So, we've spoken about this before, about the German augmented sixth chord being enharmonically equal to what other structure? Katrina?
Dominant 7.
Very good. So, because German diminished thirds are exactly the same chord, they are also enharmonically equal to a dominant 7 chord. And Miles, what does this chord tonicize? Like, what's a fifth down from the root of this? What scale degree would that be in E minor?
Oh, I'm sorry.
You'd say this is like a 5/7
of the Neapolitan.
Yeah, very good. It'd be at like a 5/4/2, a flat 2. And these chords are enharmonically equal. Before they were inversionally equal. Now these are enharmonically equal. And you already know how to resolve 5/7 chords in any inversion. Our alto could go up to A or down to F natural. But our tendency tone in the bass would resolve down. I'll play this for you. Here would be as a German diminished third. And here is as 5/4/2 of the Neapolitan. So the same sound functioning in two different ways depending on how it's written. Okay, so that was showing how Scriabin's early music basically functions in very predictable ways according to the common practice style. Now we're going to start looking at his middle period, and the Opus 51, number 2, comes from this period, and we're going to start to see him change things a little bit. So please take out your scores right now, and we're going to do some harmonic analysis. So the harmony on the downbeat of 3 should now look fairly familiar, and this corresponds to homework question 1. So first let's just address homework question 1. How about Adam? What was your answer for homework question 1? It was this harmony with an F in the bass, not a D sharp, but an F in the bass.
It is
C, D
It's
sharp.
a German, or, dominant 7.
It would be a German augmented sixth is, yeah, so you're getting to question 2, which is very good.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. So you're absolutely right. That would be where I was going after this. You're way ahead of me. That would be how it's spelled in homework question 2 as an E flat. Downbeat of 3 would be German augmented, or German diminished third, and here would be the harmony that Miles identified for us. The dominant or applied chord of the Neapolitan. And this was also one of your homework questions. Do any of the tendency tones in the harmony in measure 4, do any of the tendency tones resolve? Anybody have a thought about that? Ethan, you're nodding?
I think they all go to their proper place.
So how about the bass? The E flat, does that resolve? It does? How about the other tendency tone, the chordal third, the A? Does that resolve?
Measure 5. Yeah.
Eventually.
Yeah, it sort of resolves on downbeat of 5, but by that time, the rest of the harmony has changed. So this is sort of non-traditional, but we could say in the pickup to 5, it resolves almost to a flat 2 7th chord. So he's sort of resolving, sort of treating this as a traditional harmony, but not exactly. And let's take a look at the harmony in measure 5 and see what happens here. I would like to identify the downbeat of 5 in the soprano as a non-chord tone, as an accented passing tone. And I'll give you a clue. The brackets I put here, from G sharp up to B flat, what interval is that? G sharp to B flat, what interval is that? It's a diminished third. So this is a pretty good clue. This is indeed another diminished third chord, but not in the key of A minor. It would be in the key of D minor. And how about moving on to the downbeat of 6? Do any of the tendency tones in that diminished third chord resolve the way we would expect them to? What do you think?
They do.
They do. They resolve exactly where we would expect them to a cadential 5, 6, 4. So here's pick up 5. And goes right where we would expect it to. Tendency tones resolving converging in by half step to our octave in the key of D minor. Okay, now let's look at the end of the piece. And I would like to just group all the harmonies from measure 22 to 25 as belonging to the same category. And you notice I put some parentheses in measure 22 in the B, in the tenor voice. I would like you to discount that from your harmonic analysis. How about Renee? What harmonic label might you put on these 3 harmonies?
These three
Measure 22 through 24.
And you say discount the,
Discount the B in measure 22.
well, it looks like another one of the same.
Yeah, absolutely. It's another diminished third. They're all over this piece. And do any of its tendency tones resolve as we might expect? How about the bass, the D sharp?
It does.
It does. Wherever there's a half step, that's a tendency tone. In measure 24, that D sharp goes up to E flat, or E natural, excuse me, and then pick up to 26. So some of its tendency tones do resolve as well. Homework question 7 was about where does the opening melody return? Does anybody have a measure number? Where does the melody at the opening of the piece, where does that come back? Ethan?
Take up to 26.
Yeah, very good. I'm going to call this a recapitulation or return. And you'll notice that I borrowed a term from our sonata form terminology. I'm not claiming that this is a sonata. I just want to say that something that we saw before is coming back. So I'm using the word recapitulation or return. And that returns to sort of a 1-6-4 chord. There's that F in there, but it's sort of a 1-6-4 chord. We'll just call it that for now. What I want to emphasize is that the tonic harmony is returning at this point. And here is where things start to change a little bit from what you've learned in the common practice style. If we are to view the pickup to measure 26 as a return to the tonic harmony, I propose to you that we can view those 4 bars prior as a retransition. And there's another term borrowed from sonata form. And by calling it a retransition, I'm saying that those harmonies have a dominant function. Dominant function like the 5-7, And as you know, these German augmented sixth and diminished third chords are enharmonically equal to a dominant chord, but they're not built on scale degree 5. But in Scriabin's middle period, they start to function like a dominant chord. Question, Ethan?
So if we know that Germans often go to cadential 6/4s, but we also know that cadential 6/4s look a lot like 1/6/4, how do we know that we pick up to 26 is 1/6/4 and not cadential 6/4? Because we always get an F when we call it 1/6/4 in our homework.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I would say, I would not ask you to analyze something like this on your homework because it's irregular. All the examples that you will be graded on for homework will be highly normalized. So you don't have to worry about your grade. The purpose of this is to look at deformations of what we're used to seeing, and I will always be guiding you when we look at irregularities. It's a good question. So I propose that we can call this a sort of retransition and group it as a dominant function. And now let's look at the harmony at the end. Remember that we're conceptualizing cadences as two-part events, and normally a piece in A minor we might expect to end like this. Here's what he does instead. Highly irregular, and we haven't that picked on yet. How about then? What would you call that pickup in the penultimate bar? What harmony would you label that as? Another German diminished third chord, that's right, going to 1. So what I propose to you is that this is an even clearer example that in this piece in particular, and in Scriabin's middle period in general, the German diminished third chord has a clear dominant function. And here we see that the final cadence having a clear dominant function with this diminished third chord. Okay, let's take a listen. 22. Now, I'd like to take our analytical lens and zoom out a little bit. We've been talking about individual harmonies in this piece, and now we're going to talk about how we can group the piece as a whole. We've talked in this semester already about sentence forms, but I just want to do a little bit of a review right now. We think about sentences as having 3 parts. Usually the proportions are 2 plus 2 plus 4. That would be the most common sentence form. And we would call the first part the basic idea, and the basic idea repeated, and a continuation. And as I mentioned in the homework assignment, sometimes the continuation itself, through the process of fragmentation, is broken up into another sentence of 1, 1, and 2. And this would be a basic idea, and a continuation, all contained within the third part of the larger sentence. And what was the word we used for this? A smaller sentence contained.
Nested.
Yeah, nested. Very good. We would call that a nested sentence within the larger one. So this is homework question 3, which you had to do on the score itself. So please take out your hard copy of the score. And what we're doing is we're drawing phrasings, or we're drawing slurs, I should say, to divide the phrasing of this piece. And I did the first one for you. We called this 1 plus 1 plus 2, and we identified a nested sentence of 1/2 plus 1/2 plus 1 there. And we can call all of this our A material. Now, would anybody be willing to volunteer? How did you draw your slurs in the second system? How many bars did you put in the first slur? 1 bar, 2 bars, Miles?
I put 1. I put, it's going to pick up to like the middle of every bar, just 4 in a row, basically.
Okay, that's a viable answer. Does anybody else have a different answer?
Yeah, I did 2 bars.
You did 2 bars? Okay. That's what I did initially. Here's what I ended up settling on, and I'm not saying that this is absolutely right. I ended up calling this 2 plus 1. 2 plus 1 plus 1. And right now we're especially focusing just on the melodic motion. So if we look at where does it start to repeat itself, that's where we might draw another slur. So here's pick up to 5, just the melody. I call that a single idea, and then we have this A to C. A to C repeated, a little bit different. That's why I'm calling this 2 plus 1 plus 1. Now, homework question 8 was about transposition, which is one of Scriabin's most common compositional techniques, taking a section of music and transposing it to another key. Have we seen the material in measure 9 before? Did anybody figure measure 9 into their question 8 on the homework? Renee?
Sure, yeah, that's the material from the beginning.
Very good. And could you tell me what interval is it transposed by?
Up to the 5th.
Very good, very good. Up the 5th. So I would just call this A prime, and I would diagram it exactly the same way as 1 plus 1 plus 2, another sentence with a nested sentence. We call that A prime. Just for the purpose of time, I'll tell you what I did for the next one. I call this B prime, similar material as B, except now it's 2 plus 2. Did anybody else have anything different that they'd like to argue for? Okay. Let's take a look at the second half of the piece. Here's a repetition of what we just did, sort of overlapping. Here's the B prime, just so we can see a little bit of what we just did. Now, would anybody like to volunteer what they had for this system of music? Pick up to 17. How did you slur this music? Come on. Alex?
Is it 1, 1, and 2?
Yeah, very good. That's exactly what I did. We're giving priority to the melody. And if we follow that melody, we can call it 1 plus 1 plus 2. And I would even include a little extension. The 2 part of that is repeated partially, ending on the downbeat of 22. So I call this C material. It's related to what came before, but different enough that we can call it C material, going 1, 1, 2, with a little extension. So, and here is a crazy thing that I want to propose to you. We've seen sentence structures in this piece of 1 plus 1 plus 2. We've seen smaller ones of 1/2 plus 1/2 plus 1. And I would propose to you that we could hear this as a 2 plus 2 plus 4 plus that little extension sentence form. Tell me if you think that's a viable hearing. I'm going to start at B, pick up to 13. That's a viable way of viewing this music, plus the little extension afterwards. Continuing on in measure 22, I would say this is 1 bar plus 1 bar plus 1.5 bars, and then we're back to counting pickups. This would be a return at the ending, but altered slightly. So instead of calling it A prime, we're calling this A double prime, the last system of music. And what's altered is the continuation of that sentence form at the very end of the piece. The last 3 bars is altered a little bit. And I'd like to draw your attention to the downbeat rest in the penultimate bar. And I want to focus in on that nested sentence in those last 3 bars. You tell me, if I were to just play this, what note would you expect? Sing the next note. You know that an A is coming because he's established a pattern. So here's another way of thinking about sentence forms, and especially deformations. We know that sentences have 3 parts, and I'd like to chart them on a mathematical graph. If you're like me, you may have gone into music to get away from such graphs. But, here they are, they're back. So we've got a basic idea. Another basic idea, and as you know in statistics, if you have 2 points, you can plot a line and try try to predict where the next point would be. Well, that's where we would expect our continuation to be, but Scriabin inserts that rest in there and he alters it just slightly. Just slightly. It's near the continuation that we expect, but a little bit different. So Walter Piston, the famous American composer, said great music is not predictable, but it's inevitable. It's not exactly what you expect, but somehow it seems right. And a lot of people have said that about great music. If it was predictable, we wouldn't have to listen to it because we already know what's going to happen. And I just want to share a personal anecdote with you about what is a cadence. What is a cadence? This is getting away from music theory a little bit. There's a fellow named Narcisse Bonnet. He studied with the famous French pedagogue Nadia Boulanger, and he teaches at a summer program in Paris, and I was getting the coaching from him. We're working on Fauré's second piano quintet, and we weren't playing it exactly the way he wanted us to, and he said to me in a thick French accent, he said, "To cadence well is to die well." That always stuck with me, I don't know why. To cadence well is to die well. And what this is all about is viewing the trajectory of a piece as a life trajectory, as and that finally its energy is expended, and that at the end of the piece, there's nothing left to be said. The piece's life is over. So to cadence well is to die well. Okay. And I have one more question for you about what is phrasing. Some of you might be wondering, what's the point of diagramming all these slurs? Maybe you've never done that before. I propose two reasons. One is memorization, and the other is score preparation. Many of you are performers, and if you haven't yet, you may at some point have to memorize a piece of music. Memorizing a piece of music is like memorizing a speech. You wouldn't memorize the individual letters and words of a speech. You would group them into larger sentences and paragraphs. And research has shown that that is actually the difference between novice and expert memory. Expert memorizers don't remember more, rather they group things into larger chunks. And they actually memorize the same amount, but they group into larger chunks. And some of you may be interested in conducting. Well, how do conductors prepare a score? They often analyze the slurs, and one of my conducting friends recently said to me, he doesn't label the phrasing if it was 4 bars, because that's predictable. He labels it if it's 3 or 5 or something else. And that's one way that conductors can keep track of a large piece of music as a series of maybe 4 plus 3 plus 5 plus a break plus however many slurs or phrases added together. So memorization and score preparation are two reasons that we might want to diagram phrasing in a piece. Okay, so that was an investigation of Scriabin's middle period, where cadences have been altered a little bit. No longer dominant to tonic, but now he was using that German augmented or diminished third chord to go to tonic. But the second bullet point under the middle period, he still resolved it to a tonic triad. There was still that urge to resolve. Now we're going to look at the late period where things start to break down even more. So I said that Scriabin was in this mystical occult society. Well, in a lot of his late music, he uses something which musicologists and theorists term the mystic chord. It sounds mystical. I don't know, maybe? It could maybe sound a little mystical. So one way to analyze this harmony when it's arranged like this would be as stacked fourths. If you just count the letter names, A, D, G flat, or A, D, G, C, F, B, they're all a fourth apart. Granted, they're not all perfect fourths. Some of them are diminished and augmented, but it's still fourths. Now, Ben, I know you have some experience with jazz harmony. If we were to label this as a 5/7 chord, what tensions would there be as well?
5/7 in D flat.
5/7 in D flat major, yep.
A 13, a
Yep.
9, and a sharp 11.
Yeah, very good. 13, and I'll just put them in descending order. 13, sharp, 11, and 9. And if this were a jazz chord, we might expect it to resolve like this. This would be a traditional resolution. Everything moving down by step, except the bass, which moves down by fifth. Tell me, do you think you can hear this as a jazz harmony? loud there, maybe. And maybe hear that as resolving to a 1 major 7 with a 13 and a 9, maybe in a jazz context. Well, Scriabin does not write that cadence. And here's what he does with the mystic chord. I want you to watch carefully. I'm going to keep the same notes of the chord, and I'm going to rearrange them a little bit. All the same pitches, but they've been rearranged into a different inversion. Now I use that word in scare quotes because when a harmony is this complex, it's tenuous whether we can even describe different inversions of it. All I want to indicate with that word is that there's a different note in the bass. There's a different note in the bass, and I won't even ask you because there's no way you would know where he would resolve this to, and I use that also in scare quotes, resolve. So he's going to make a cadence out of this mystic harmony. And remember, our cadences had two parts. One was dominant function, another was tonic function. Well, here's his tonic that he goes to. What do you know? A perfect cadence. So there's how he resolves his mystic chord to an F sharp major triad. And we could say this is sort of in the key of F sharp major, sort of in the key of G flat. I shouldn't even put that there because you can barely say that it's in a key. It just ends on an F sharp major triad. And I propose that another way that we could look at this harmony would be to isolate this bass pedal point and just group the harmonies above. Look at that as a unit. So we've got a B flat, D, F, and A flat, and a C. We could call that a B flat 7 chord with over an F sharp bass, which totally ruins the sound, but you can maybe hear that as having another sort of dominant quality to it, resolving to F sharp. Okay, so let's take a look at how he actually uses this in the context of a piece of music. You were listening to the Prometheus, or the Poem of Fire, at the beginning of the piece, and we're going to return to it here. This is actually a single movement. It's 30 minutes long. It's 30 minutes long. It's for a huge orchestra, chorus, and as an organist, I love that he includes organ in there. So this is a reduction of the entire orchestral score. And I just put the organ there because every other instrument that you hear is a doubling of those notes. It's just easier to view it in a reduced score. And we can hear there's like 6 trumpets playing really loud. You'll hear them when we play this. But before we listen, I just want to tell you a little bit of background about Prometheus. Remember at the beginning of the class I said that Scriabin was in this cult called the Sons of the Flame of Wisdom. It was a Promethean cult. So what's the flame all about? Does anybody know the story of Prometheus? What did he steal from the gods? He stole something and gave it to humanity. He stole fire. That's right. And for Scriabin, this wasn't just physical fire. This was like divine inspiration. Think about a spark. We use the same metaphors to describe inspiration, like a spark. So part of this cult was that Scriabin actually wrote that humanity became closer to the gods through the act of creation. So that divine spark was given to us from the gods, and that human beings could elevate themselves through the act of creation. And that's why they almost worshipped Prometheus as doing that for humanity. Anybody know how was Prometheus punished for stealing this?
Wasn't he like chained to a rock?
Absolutely.
And
An eagle ate away his liver every day.
Don't ask me how I
You're
know
right.
that.
You got all the details. A rock, he was chained there. Every day, an eagle would eat out his liver. And because he was a titan, the liver would regenerate and it would eat it out again the next day. And he was sentenced to do this for all time until Hercules came and slaughtered the eagle and freed the titan Prometheus. Okay, so back to our harmonic analysis of the very end of this epic piece. It's 30 minutes long, and this is how Scriabin chose to end the piece. We see the mystic chord is prolonged this entire way, and that's our dominant function. That's the first part of our cadence, and our tonic function at the end. And before I play it, I'll just also add that this comes from Opus 60, which is at the very beginning of his late period. And this is one of the last times that Scriabin ever ended a piece with a triad. After this, he almost never ends pieces with triads because, as you can see, he's weakened the cadential motion so much that I think he just said, what's the point in sticking with these triadic conventions? Okay, so here's the end of Prometheus. What an ending, right? After half an hour. So, a little bit of a review. Throughout our class, we've seen that Scriabin's music had 3 different periods, and as a summary, we can view these 3 stylistic periods as progressively breaking down the cadence. And what's the big deal? Why am I talking about the cadence so much? Well, in tonality, we could say that cadences are the defining event of tonality. And by weakening the cadence, he's weakening the tonal system as a whole. And this isn't just in Scriabin's music. As you see, he died in 1915. And lots of composers at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century are experimenting ways in which that they can extend tonality and alter it, and even try to see how far they can push it. And the composers like Arnold Schoenberg are, at the beginning of the 20th century, eventually say, we're not even going to write tonal music anymore. So we can view Scriabin's stylistic progression as a sort of microcosm of greater trends that are going on in music at this time. So we have a couple minutes left, and I would like to, as a sort of coda, I would like to compare a couple of recordings of this piece. So if you could take out your scores again, please. We're just going to listen to the first part of this. And I'd like to give you a couple of things to listen to in this piece. As you're listening to these 2 pianists, I'd like you to consider how they phrase it, how they voicing just means which notes are louder and softer on the piano. For instance, bringing out the melody or the bass, or having the accompaniment be quieter. What's their tempo like, and how much do they depart from the score? And you'll hear what I mean by that. I've got 2 anonymous recordings because my purpose here is not to bash any pianists. I just want to compare them. So I just kept their identities anonymous. So here's the first recording. See what our second artist does with just those 2 systems. Both too loud? Okay, well, it could be my fault with the recording. I might have been playing them too loud. Or do you mean that you could tell?
Oh, you can hear from the piano timbre. It sounded to me like they were related. It sounded to me
More sotto voce, even as he marks at the beginning of the piece. Miles?
Were both of these different than the recording you sent?
Yeah.
That's what I thought, because when I listened to the recording that you sent, it seemed so much more fragmented. Just every pickup was like the start of an event, and here I thought both performers created what sounded like longer phrases.
Okay, interesting. Alex?
I heard a lot more ebb and flow in the tempo fluctuation in the second
In the
one,
second
not
one.
very much, but
Yeah,
it sounded,
I did too.
it breathed a little bit more.
Yeah. Renee, what were you gonna say?
I was just gonna say the compliments of that, the first one just was relentless. It reminded,
In
for
which
some
way was
reason,
it
I thought of a
relentless?
wheel turning for some reason.
Okay.
Just, yeah, it just never.
Do you mean like the eighth notes were more equal, whereas in the second one they were?
I thought so, and there wasn't as much delineation between the phrases.
Yeah. Anyone else have other thoughts, Ben?
I thought the melody was much more prominently voiced in the second recording.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So, the purpose of doing this is just to not say that one is better or one is worse, but students in conservatories often, not always, but often have the idea that there's one right answer for how to play a piece of music. And we could say that the first recording was a little bit more literal to the score in terms of, well, when I see equal eighth notes, I'm going to play them equally, darn it, right? And my point here is just to say, to let you know that you have the artistic license to depart from the score in subtle ways like this. And of course, you could go even further, but I just want you to know that the score is not this unchangeable object, that you have the right as artists to do as much or little between these two composers, or these pianists, or even more if you wanted to. Any closing ideas or thoughts about this piece? Any questions that you've had while you're doing the homework that we didn't address in class? Ben?
I noticed in the three periods, there's like a little year between each of them. Was there
Yeah.
a year when he like stopped writing music?
Yes, he didn't. He took some time off from composition between the middle period and the second period, and the late period. Yeah. Any other questions? If not, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.